Hello.
Hi there. How are you?
¿Cómo están? Voy a partir yo. Hablo español. Natasha, que está aquí con nosotras, nos va a traducir. Y quiero partir dando las gracias a The Center for Fiction por la invitación. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí esta tarde con ustedes. Y una de las razones de esta felicidad no es solamente estar aquí, sino también estar tan bien acompañada. Acompañada de mi querida Natasha y de mi querida Lina, con quien hemos constelado durante mucho tiempo en este planeta o en este sistema escritural, ¿no?
So Nona is going to start out. She says that I, Natasha, will be translating for her. She thanks the Center for Fiction. She says, I'm happy to be here, and especially because I am so well accompanied by Natasha and also by Lina, with whom I have shared a cosmos of sorority for a long time.
Para partir voy a introducir esta conversación. Lina y yo vamos a leer trocitos de nuestros libros y yo quiero partir leyendo el comienzo de The Twilight Zone, La Dimensión Desconocida. Leeré en español y luego Natasha lo leerá en inglés para ustedes.
Nona will begin by reading in Spanish. I will read in English, and then Lina will read in English.
Lo imagino caminando por una calle del centro, un hombre alto, delgado, de pelo negro, con unos bigotes gruesos y oscuros. En su mano izquierda trae una revista doblada. La aprieta con fuerza, parece afirmarse de ella mientras avanza. Lo imagino apurado, fumando un cigarrillo, mirando de un lado a otro nervioso, cerciorándose de que nadie lo sigue. Es el mes de agosto, específicamente la mañana del 27 de agosto de 1984. Lo imagino entrando a un edificio en la calle Huérfanos al llegar a Bandera. Se trata de las oficinas de redacción de la revista Cauce. Pero eso no lo imagino, eso lo leí. La recepcionista del lugar lo reconoce. No es la primera vez que él llega a hacer la misma petición. Necesita hablar con la periodista que ha escrito el artículo que está en la revista que trae. Me cuesta imaginar a la mujer de la recepción. No logro configurar un rostro claro para ella, ni siquiera la expresión con la que mira a este hombre nervioso, pero sé que desconfía de él y de su urgencia. Imagino que intenta disuadirlo, que le dice que la persona que busca no está, que no vendrá en todo el día, que no insista, que se vaya, que no vuelva. Y también imagino, porque eso es lo que me toca en esta historia, que la escena es interrumpida por una voz femenina, que si cierro los ojos también puedo imaginar mientras escribo. Usted me está buscando a mí, dice. ¿Qué necesita? El hombre observa con detalle a la mujer que le ha hablado. Probablemente la conoce bien. Debe haberla visto antes en alguna fotografía. Quizá le hizo algún seguimiento o investigó una fecha con sus antecedentes. Es la mujer que busca, la que ha escrito el artículo que leyó y trae consigo. Lo sabe. Por eso se acerca y le extiende la mano derecha entregándole su tarjeta de identificación como miembro de las Fuerzas Armadas. Imagino que la periodista no esperaba algo así. Observa la tarjeta desconcertada, podría agregar asustada. Andrés Antonio Valenzuela Morales, soldado primero, carnet de identidad 39.432 de la comuna de La Ligua. Luego, de la información, una fotografía con el número de registro 66.650 que no imagino, que leo aquí, en el testimonio que la misma periodista escribió tiempo después. Quiero hablarle de cosas que he hecho, le dice el hombre mirándola a los ojos, e imagino un leve temblor en su voz en el momento de pronunciar estas palabras que no son imaginadas. Quiero hablarle de desaparecimiento de personas.
Before I repeat the same reading in English, I'd like to say that I'm Natasha Wimmer, and I'm very happy to be here today translating, interpreting for Nona. And I'd like to say that this is an interesting experiment for me because I've always worked on the page with plenty of time to think about how perfectly to put the sentence in English. And tonight, I will not have that luxury. So let me go ahead and read here. I imagine him walking down a city street, a tall man, thin, black hair, bushy mustache. In his left hand is a folded magazine. He grips it tightly, seeming to draw strength from it as he walks. I imagine him in a hurry, smoking a cigarette, glancing nervously from side to side, making sure no one is following him. It's the month of August, specifically the morning of August 27, 1984. I imagine him going into a building at Calle Huérfanos and Bandera, the editorial offices of Tause magazine. I'm not imagining that part. I read it. The receptionist recognizes him. He's come before with the same request. He needs to talk to the reporter who wrote the article in the magazine he's carrying. I have a hard time imagining the woman at the reception desk. I can't form a clear picture of her, not even her expression as she eyes the nervous man before her. But I'm sure she's wary of him and his urgency. I imagine she tries to put him off, tells him the person he wants isn't here and won't be in all day. There's no point waiting. He should leave and not come back. And I also imagine, because that's my role in this story, a female voice interrupting the scene. A voice I can imagine as I write if I close my eyes. It's me you want, the voice says. How can I help you? The man studies the woman speaking to him. Probably he knows all about her. He must have seen a picture of her at some point. Maybe he tailed her once or read her file. She's the person he wants. The one who wrote the article he read and brought with him. He's sure of it. Which is why he approaches her and extends his right hand, offering her his armed forces ID card. I imagine the reporter wasn't expecting anything like this. She looks at the card in bewilderment and fear, I might add. Andres Antonio Valenzuela Morales, Soldier First Class, ID number 39432, District of La Ligua. Accompanying this information is a photograph stamped with the registration number 66650. I'm not imagining that part either. I'm reading it right here in a statement later written by the same reporter. I want to tell you about some things I've done, says the man, looking her in the eye. And I imagine his voice shaking slightly as he speaks these words, which aren't imagined. I want to tell you about making people disappear.
Oh, well, my turn now. Thank you for this great reading. I love to hear it in Spanish and English. I also reheard it in audiobook this last week, and it's an amazing novel by Nona. I'm Lina Meruane, and I will also be doing something that I'm not very used to, which is also translating my own conversation to Nona so that we have a sort of more dynamic evening. So excuse our back and forth with Spanish and English. And I also want to thank, before I start my reading, the Center for Fiction and the entire team for making this possible. And also our great editors at Grey Wolf and all that amazing team, which has made this event also possible. So I'm going to be reading from my new book. It's Nervous System. I don't see if you can, yeah, you can see it there. And I'm going to just read a random section, which I thought had a little bit of humor in it, which is not exactly my usual tone, but this novel has some moments of those. And it's a moment where the stepmother and the daughter, called Ella, are talking about the possibility of the mother getting a silicone breast because she's had her breast removed due to cancer. And something else, whispered the mother, lowering her voice until it was almost inaudible. What is it? Asked Ella, blowing on her eyes to keep her from crying. I think your dad has another family. Another family? Thought Ella, looking with horror, fright, trembling synapse. Another family? Feeling her blood congeal in her chest, her blood pressure drop. But her father already had not one, but two families, the children born of the first mother and the twins born of the second. Could there be even more families, more wives of her father, more daughters who were her sisters? She wondered. And Ella thought that if anyone would know, it would have to be the lady. And then she thought maybe the lady was the other woman, the secret mother. Another family? That's what I think, said the mother, nodding, lowering her voice so much that Ella had to lean closer to her mouth. And the woman must be very expensive, she whispered. He must have a lot of children with her, she went on, and she dried her eyes with her sleeve and wiped her nose. Are you sure? Ella said, pulling the mother's hand from her face so she could look her in the eyes. I asked him for money for the silicone breast, and he told me he didn't have a cent in the bank. Nothing, no retirement. How could he not have anything when he spent his whole life working like a dog? And what did he do with all the money your mother left you? The mother stared at her, and Ella couldn't tell whether her eyes held compassion or accusation, and she felt her blood spin like it was in a centrifuge, and her face turned red, and then the mother twisted her lips and dug a hard knuckle into Ella's sternum. You know something. Thanks. So we're going to go ahead with some questions. I'm going to introduce our first question. We're both going to be sort of talking about the theme of this night, which is la sororidad, sorority among us. And I wanted to ask Nona to talk a little bit about the moment we both started writing, because we are contemporaries. Nona, hablar de la contemporaneidad nuestra. I wanted just to say that the moment we both started writing and publishing is right after the so-called end of the dictatorship, que empezamos a escribir justo después del supuesto final de la dictadura, and which was a very interesting cultural moment, I'd say, coming out of a cultural blackout, después del apagón cultural. So Nona, could you talk about a little bit about your experience, and then I'll follow on with mine.
Sí, yo creo que era un momento extraño, ahora podemos observarlo, ¿no? Extraño sin duda, lo primero era el apagón cultural. Los escritores y las escritoras eran seres como o que estaban muertos o no sabíamos dónde estaban. Y además era un momento muy, muy complejo políticamente, porque estaba volviendo la democracia, pero también era un momento difícil porque estábamos comenzando a comprender que la democracia era una democracia especial, ¿cierto? Que no era la democracia que nos habían prometido. Entonces era un momento extraño, donde todo apuntaba a que teníamos que ser felices, a que teníamos que ser un éxito, a que teníamos que hacerlo muy bien, porque el país iba hacia ese lugar, y nosotros empezábamos a constatar algo que no estaba cuajando en esos lugares, ¿no? Natasha?
I think it was a strange moment. We can see that now in hindsight. There was a cultural blackout, writers were dead or we didn't know where they were. It was a complex moment politically because democracy was returning, but we started to realize it was a special kind of democracy. There was something strange about it. We had to be happy. We wanted things to be a success, but we realized that things were not quite what they seemed.
Y hay que decirlo también, un momento donde también el trabajo de escritura para las mujeres era un espacio complejo, muy difícil, sigue siéndolo, es un espacio siempre en disputa, pero en ese momento quienes estábamos partiendo en la escritura, y ahí compartimos escenario con la Lina y compartimos mucho de esas disputas, se volvió un momento complejo, como muy, muy complejo. Y eso yo creo que es una realidad que las mujeres que escribimos hemos experimentado todas, en todos los escenarios del mundo, ¿no?
It was also a moment when writing for women was complex. was a space in dispute, a scene that I shared with Lina, and really a reality that all women who write have to deal with.
Quizá ahí podríamos conversar brevemente, Lina, también, ahí te lo propongo, cómo también el trabajo escritural para nosotras se vuelve por una parte un trabajo estético y de investigación literaria, sin duda, pero también se vuelve un trabajo de activismo. Ser escritora en Chile también implica ser activista en relación a que necesitamos hacernos un espacio y sobre todo necesitamos hacer un espacio a nuestras compañeras y a las escritoras del futuro, ¿no? Y eso es un doble trabajo, escribir acá, ¿no?
So I would also suggest that we could talk about the work of writing, because it is an aesthetic task, but it also becomes an activist task, particularly in Chile. We have to make a space for ourselves, and we have to make a space for the women who come after us, and it becomes a double job. Lina, Nona.
No sé si te quieres referir a eso, Lina, algo.
Yeah. Sí, perdón. You have to tell me when to jump in. So because we are three in the panel. So yes, so let me go back to the same issues that Nona was talking about. The question of coming out of a very difficult period where things were not settled, and they would not be until basically today. And also in that context, very interesting things happened. And I was thinking that you might talk about this, but I will, since you didn't, Nona. There were a lot of literary workshops. It was a cultural flourishing. So we didn't share talleres literarios. We didn't share literary workshops. But we both went through sort of that engaging with other people who wrote. And in my case, I knew nobody who wrote. So this was my sort of the end of the dictatorship coincided for me with starting university, which was very exciting, right? And then also starting workshops of writing and meeting people who were quite different to my family, because my family was a middle-class, sort of scared family. And the people I was meeting were not scared, were very basically activists, as Nona was saying, right? And this is also crossed with the question of feminism. We didn't have, I think, Nona and I, no tuvimos realmente modelos de mujeres. We didn't have, strong women writers who were our models. And of course, there were very important female writers, but they were hard to find. Eran difíciles de encontrar, las mujeres, las escritoras. So we had to basically open space for ourselves amongst other young writers who were not very happy to have other female writers among them. And we had to basically teach them that we were also going to be part of the literary world. Y estoy diciendo que nos costó un poco con el mundo masculino, pero que tuvimos que abrirnos espacio y que nos costó un poco y tuvimos que un poco enseñarle a los colegas que nosotros también íbamos a ser parte de ese mundo. Yeah. And I think that what happened there, which I also think is interesting politically, is that I think the women who were writing, and we were not two, we were a few, we were many actually, we had to understand that sorority was very important politically, to sort of share the space, to open the space for each other and for the younger women that are coming sort of behind us in time, to really become stronger together and to form alliances. And I think that has been sort of a very important political endeavor that we started and that is still alive today, as you can see, because we are still very good friends and we have done a lot of things together in the last 20 years. Entonces, para traducirte, Nona, que nos activamos, que políticamente entendimos que la sororidad la solidaridad eran importantes, abrirnos caminos entre nosotras y abrirle camino a las más jóvenes. Y desde entonces que estamos trabajando políticamente y estéticamente juntas, más o menos lo que dije.
Claro, claro.
Versión suelta.
Sí. Y yo creo que intentando pasar por más puntos, es interesante ver, para mí es muy bonito ver cómo desde muy jóvenes o desde que nos iniciamos escribiendo, sentimos la necesidad de armar sistemas, ¿no? De estar constelando juntas, de trabajar cada una en lo suyo, pero estar observándonos y cuidándonos de lejos, ¿no? De lejos y de cerca. Siempre ha sido como el ejercicio que hemos tenido, por lo menos las escritoras de nuestra generación, ¿no? Y es el que yo siento contigo también. Entonces, pensando en esa metáfora del sistema, en esa metáfora del cosmos, de los sistemas en los cuales uno orbita, o elige orbitar también, quisiera pasar al otro punto, al cosmos. Porque el cosmos es una imagen muy presente en estos dos trabajos que nosotros hoy día estamos presentando. Natasha.
Of course, I think it's also interesting and lovely to see how since we were very young, we felt the need to make systems to come together, to watch out for each other from near and from far. And thinking of the metaphor of systems or cosmos, I'd like to move on to another point because the cosmos has been an important element in my writing and also in Lina's writing.
Sí, y pienso en concreto en el sistema nervioso y en una obsesión que está presente en tu escritura en general, que es la observación de los cuerpos, ¿cierto? Esta mirada de diagnóstico que tienen muchos de tus personajes con respecto al cuerpo, a observar el cuerpo, a observar las enfermedades del cuerpo, las huellas del cuerpo, el cuerpo como un material de registro también. Y en este libro en específico, esa mirada existe, pero se tensa con el cosmos, ¿cierto? Se va en fuga de algo muy íntimo a algo lejísimo, ¿no? Que es el cosmos. Entonces mi pregunta tiene que ver, mi pregunta es, ¿por qué esa tensión? ¿Qué buscaste allí? ¿O qué necesidad hay de eso? Me llama la atención porque evidentemente, paralelamente yo también necesité esa fuga, necesité irme hacia el cosmos, ¿no?
And I'm thinking specifically about in Nervous System, Lina's novel, and the obsession with bodies in your writing, which is diagnostic. You think a lot about the mark of bodies, and that gaze is there in this book, but your gaze is also on the cosmos. And my question is, why is there that tension? Why do you feel the need for that flight? Mm-hmm. And I have also felt that need in my writing.
Yes, I have to say, thank you, Nona, for that nice, beautiful question. I think this is something that sort of happened in a very strange manner because in the beginning, I had no interest in the cosmos, as you have, Nona, because your work has sort of recurred in this metaphor of outer space, space invaders, right? The technologies of space and of games that have to do with space, right? So for me, it was actually something that I had not really thought of at all, because as you say, Nona, I have been sort of in the last 10 years been working on specifically on the body and on ill bodies. So, bueno, lo que entendiste esto que dijeron así? Okay, great. So in the last books I've written, Seeing Red and Nervous System, and a previous one that hasn't been translated into English, I have been thinking of the relationship between the sick and the healthy, and how I find that is not real, that we are not actually sick or healthy, but we are always sort of somewhere in that gray zone in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. But the fact is that my previous novels had been about sick and healthy people, like opposites. Lo que estoy diciendo es que yo siempre había pensado entre la salud y la enfermedad como dos opuestos, pero pensaba que la gente estaba siempre en algún lugar intermedio y sin embargo mis novelas tenían enfermos y sanos. So what I tried to do in this novel was to think, how could I maybe explore a universe of human beings where everybody was sick. Quería explorar un universo donde estuvieran todos enfermos. So even how do you call it? Al perro de peluche, Natasha, do you know that word?
Stuffed animal. Even the
Yeah,
stuffed
even the stuffed animal is called gastroenteritis or something like that. So everybody is completely obsessed with the frailty of the body. But in the process of writing, I thought, I don't want to have again characters that are only doctors. No quería solo tener personajes doctores, ¿no? So I started trying to think, so what could my protagonist be? And I had this sort of strange memory of my time when I was a journalist. Me acordé del tiempo en que yo era periodista. And I interviewed a couple of poets, very important poets. Entrevisté a unos poetas. And one of them was a hardcore mathematician, and the other one was an astrophysicist. Uno era matemático y el otro era astrofísico. And I thought, that's so odd. How can these really scientific people be writing poetry? But then I realized that they're actually, the sort of the kind of abstract thinking that they were doing was very poetic. And my character was already very, very much of a poet. There's a lot of poetry in this text. So I thought, oh, so then she has to be in astrophysics. She has to have this idea of the space as a place of the cosmos, as a space to imagine the world. And as soon as I started reading about cosmology and planetary sciences, I fell in love with astronomy. Bueno, lo que estaba diciendo era, ¿entendiste? Que bueno, que me puse a decidir, y en cuanto decidí me puse a leer sobre el cosmos, me encantó. And just to finish and not make this answer too long, and I also realized that by reading that we are so connected to space, that our bones even are formed by the chemicals that come from stars, right? Or at least that's the idea that has been spelled out by physicists. So I suddenly understood that there was a very neat relationship between our own bodies and the stars and the planets and the Big Bang and the black holes and all of that. But also that in the antiquity, the old philosophers had believed that our maladies and our illnesses came from the movement of the stars and the planets. And bueno, y que los antiguos también creían que el cuerpo estaba conectado con el universo. So I was really just going back to something that had been thought of and that we modern people had forgotten. And I wanted to go back to that. Y bueno, nosotros como modernos nos habíamos olvidado de esa relación especulativa de los antiguos, y que yo quería volver un poco también a esa relación. So just to finish now, I wanted you, Nona, to talk also about your early relation with the cosmos. I think you found that, and I feel like I have sort of followed your steps in that metaphor. But I think that you have done a really amazing work with also the question of the bones and the stars and the disappearance, and especially, and this is something that we might discuss, time and space. Y bueno, y quería preguntarte, Nona, a ti también sobre tu temprana relación con el cosmos, con la cuestión de los desaparecidos y la cuestión política, y si tienes ganas podríamos también hablar del tiempo y el espacio, la cuestión del tiempo, que es muy linda en tu trabajo.
Sí. Yo creo que originalmente el porqué de mi fuga, de mi propia fuga al cosmos, tiene que ver con algo muy biográfico también, y muy pedestre, muy pedestre. Y voy a ser muy honesta, cuando yo era pequeña veía los capítulos de Cosmos, la serie de Carl Sagan, y cada vez que yo veía esa serie, yo sentía que había algo inconmensurable, que era mucho más extenso y poderoso y maravilloso que la pequeña realidad en la que vivíamos, ¿no? Era casi como esa, una sensación similar a la que sentía con la ficción. Otro lugar de escape maravilloso, ¿no? Natasha, te voy a dejar.
I think originally the reason for my flight toward the cosmos is biographical and ordinary, really very ordinary. I watched the Carl Sagan series Cosmos, and I felt that there was something, when I watched it, I felt that there was something vaster and greater than our own reality. It was like an escape.
Y como para ti el cuerpo y su enfermedad y sus huellas han sido como una obsesión, para mí lo han sido el pasado reciente de Chile, ha sido mi propia obsesión, ¿no? Y trabajando sobre archivos, trabajando sobre la historia reciente de Chile, encontré en las estrellas específicamente una metáfora muy sencilla, porque es muy sencilla, de lo que es la importancia de esa presencia del pasado en nuestro presente, ¿no? Las estrellas, lo sabemos, son luces que han viajado millones de años para llegar acá, muchas de ellas en este momento no existen, esa luz que vemos puede ser una estrella muerta, sin embargo, por lo tanto lo que vemos es el pasado. Y esa metáfora de alguna manera me hizo espejear los materiales tan crudos con los que me ha tocado trabajar y he querido trabajar sin duda, ¿no? Encontrando en el pasado una presencia presente y encontrando ahí también un reflejo de lo necesario que es para poder leernos el día a día. Acá hay algo que, perdón, Natasha.
Quizás perdí un poquito al final. I might have lost just a little bit at the end. In the same way that for you, the body and illness were obsessions, my obsession was the recent past of Chile. And working archives, I found a metaphor, working the archives of the history of Chile, I found a metaphor in the stars, really a very simple metaphor. The presence of the past in our life is like the light from stars, which comes from millions of years away. And that light is also the past. And ahí me perdí un poco.
No, pero está bien. Creo que, y aquí entro a los tiempos, ¿no? Y también te voy a hacer una pregunta sobre eso. El tiempo es una necesidad que hemos generado, la humanidad ha generado para poder organizarnos, ¿no? Pero el tiempo, lo sabemos, no es lineal. El tiempo no sé cómo es, pero no necesariamente es lineal. Las estrellas nos lo van a entender, ¿cierto? Ese pasado está presente y brilla en nuestro presente. Por lo tanto, el tiempo es infinitamente relativo, ¿cierto? El pasado y el presente son tiempos muy extraños que conviven, están siempre en el presente, ¿no? Y ahí voy a citar a una conocida nuestra, Lina, a la Nelly Richard, que tiene esa frase que a mí me fascina, que es que hay que estar constantemente actualizando el recuerdo, porque el recuerdo por el recuerdo no sirve de nada. El recuerdo tiene que ser activo, ¿no? Ay, Natasha.
¿Me puedes repetir lo que dijo Nelly Richard?
Mira, no me sé la frase, pero es como que hay que actualizar el recuerdo, que los recuerdos son importantes en la medida que se actualizan, ¿no? Y que dialogan con el presente.
Actualizar, o sea que traídos al presente, ¿no?
Exacto.
Okay.
Exacto.
If I may chip in, I have the quote here, I think. Dice, hay que volver a dotar la energía al recuerdo.
Ah,
Sí.
claro,
Que entable una conversación con el presente disconforme.
Exactamente.
Sí, es el epígrafe de
Sí.
Voyager. Yeah, yeah.
Voyager.
Y ahora no lo tengo, pero bueno, voy a leer en inglés. Time is a necessity that humanity needs to organize itself, but it's not actually linear. We don't really know what it is. And we know that from the stars because we see the light of stars from the past in our own present, and it is our present, but it's also the past. So it's relative. I'd like to quote Nelly Richard, someone Lina and I both know well, who writes that, paraphrasing, that memories must be brought into the present, must be actualized.
Y en ese sentido, en esta idea de desbaratar la convención del tiempo, pienso en el sistema nervioso y en la ubicación que tú haces de la protagonista está en el país del presente, pero viene del país del pasado. Yo intuyo o que el país del presente es Estados Unidos y el país del pasado es Chile. Reconozco en ese país del pasado, aunque no lo nombras, a Chile. A mí me gustó mucho ese nombrar a Chile de esa manera, porque, bueno, lo sabemos, Chile es un país que ha estado atrapado, desgraciadamente, en su pasado. Estamos viviendo un proceso histórico que así lo demuestra. Estamos por fin intentando salir de la dictadura con la escritura de una nueva constitución. Y mi pregunta entonces sería, Lina, también me quedé con una frase que dice ella en algún momento, y es, si queremos, ¿cómo lo dice ella? Uy, la perdí, pero es como cargamos con una herencia y queremos salvarnos de esa herencia. Mi pregunta es si podemos salvarnos de ese país del pasado, si es posible sacárnoslo de encima en nuestras escrituras, por ejemplo, porque veo en nuestro trabajo que hemos estado siempre condenadas a escribir de ese país del pasado, ¿no? De una u otra manera. Y lo otro es si queremos salir de ese síntoma, si queremos olvidarnos de esa herencia. Uy, Natasha, fui eterna.
I got it. Lo tengo. So in this sense, I think about nervous system. The protagonist lives in the country of the present. That the way Lina puts it in the book is that the protagonist is from the country lives in the country of the present, but comes from the country of the past. That's the term that she uses for where she comes from. And the country of the past, or the country of the present, is the United States, and the country of the past is Chile. And Nona says, I like that a lot because Chile is trapped in the past. And finally, at last, it's trying to escape the dictatorship. And I remember something that the protagonist says, that we have an inheritance. But my question is, can we save ourselves from the country of the past? Can we escape? Can we escape from the country of the past? And do we really want to?
Well, I actually think that that's a very intense question for Nona, because she has obsessively worked on the past, right? And its echoes in the present. And I think we can talk a little bit about that if we still have a little bit of time. But I also think that, so I think we have both thought about the ways in which the past reincarnates or never leaves us, right? In your case, I'd say that it's in the memory, it stays in the memory, right? And it needs to be spelled out in writing. And I think you have taken sort of as a task to write and rewrite and fictionalize and come back to the archive of the past, right? And see how it's sort of echoing still today. And I think in my case, I have thought about that incarnation of the past in our own bodies. So many of the characters of this book sort of are revealing or manifesting the pains of the past, the pains of their history, their losses, the violence that has occurred in the past, but also is occurring in the present, and how that's manifesting again in their own ill bodies, right? And the ways in which they're trying to reconnect and make the best of the past in the present, right? But I also thought, as I was reading about the cosmos and falling in love with all these amazing texts, the ones that I could actually decipher, because there's a lot of maths in the cosmos, as you know, Nona. I was also thinking about sort of the question of the temporality and how it's put together. Mm-hmm. And you were saying the past is not linear. Uy, no te traduje nada, Nona. ¿Me vas siguiendo?
Voy entendiendo, voy entendiendo.
Okay. So the past is not linear. How is it, right? And this is the basic question, right, for astrophysicists, right? What is the time? And so I try to bring into the writing of the book in its fragmentary shape, in its putting together past and present and moving from past to present. I was trying to put into form, so to speak, that notion of a time that is fragmentary, that is not linear, that comes back and forth, that stretches and then becomes very quick. And I was trying to produce this effect in the book, for better or worse. It's always hard to tell whether it was just too, it just was an idea in my mind, so to speak, rather than in the actual book. But I did think that it was important to bring to the book this notion of time and space working in very mysterious ways in the histories of these characters. And also this idea that her past can become her present when she goes back. Her past is also always her present, like the stars you were saying, right?
Claro.
That appear in your book. No te traduje nada, pero si quieres te puedo sintetizar un poco, Nona.
No, pero creo haberte entendido.
Sí, la
Lina.
cuestión de la estructura del tiempo y el espacio en la propia forma del libro y esta cosa que va para adelante y para atrás y que se estira, que se pone corta, etcétera.
Sí, y sabes que sobre eso que apuntaste me gusta mucho hablar también, pues, o sea, me gustaría agregar algo, que tu libro tiene, bueno, el mío también tiene esta cosa fragmentada, que yo creo que es una manera de intentar traducir la memoria, ¿no? El archivo de la memoria, que en el caso del sistema nervioso es un archivo corporal, pero además es un archivo familiar, de una constelación de personas, ¿no? Que eso es muy bonito, porque son recuerdos y son los recuerdos de los cuerpos, ¿no? Y los diagnósticos de los cuerpos. Entonces se vuelve más complejo también en tu libro, que eso es muy interesante, de cómo vamos... de cómo nos interiorizamos a una memoria médica de un grupo humano. Y esa memoria médica habla, como que es un poco el proyecto tuyo, esos cuerpos son archivos de memoria, ¿cierto? Cargan con una herencia, cargan con una historia y la empiezan a develar sin tener que contarnos sus recuerdos necesariamente, son sus cuerpos los que hablan. Eso es muy bonito. Eso es muy bonito.
Gracias.
A ver.
Natasha.
Me dijiste que hablara nomás, Natasha.
So what Natasha writes, I will just say that I want to ask you about the archive before we have to go.
Okay, I'm ready. So, you know what you said, your book and mine too is fragmented, which is a way of translating memory and the way memory works. But it's also a constellation of families and of diagnoses of the body, and particularly how we internalize medical memory, but kind of bodies as archives of memory in the sense that memory develops in the body, and we can read the memory in the body without the person having to actually tell us the memories.
Yeah, and speaking of archive, as I was saying, I know, Nona, that you have worked really intensely with Chile's history, but not the official history, but actually the archives, right? You have produced documentaries, you have produced a number of novels that cross between something that I suspect has to do with your own biography and the people you have met along the way, coming from school till today. But also like all those letters and all those documents in the Vicaría de la Solidaridad, which was the organ of the church, sort of the left-wing church that produced its own institution to protect people, to bring their cases to justice, and to file all their own archives, right? Their letters, their complaints, their testimonies, etc. And I was sort of really curious about how you have produced a literature out of documents that can be very difficult to read and hard to read and maybe sometimes very dry. La pregunta tiene que ver cómo has trabajado el archivo a lo largo de los años, cruzado con tu propia experiencia, y cómo has convertido eso en literatura. Eso que es doloroso, difícil, seco, arduo, etc.
Y un poquito, no, si puedes hablar un poquito más lento. Gracias.
Perfecto. Sí, mi intención siempre ha sido ir a contrapelo, no sé si se entiende, Natasha, ir en contra de la historia oficial, ¿no? Proponer una historia otra, Es un poco lo que hemos vivido las mujeres siempre, que la historia de las mujeres nunca ha sido contada porque es una historia que existe en un espacio íntimo. De alguna manera siento que la historia oficial de Chile, la historia íntima, tampoco no ha sido contada, ¿no? Son esos espacios de intimidad, los espacios que están, los espacios domésticos, las pequeñas historias, las que nunca tienen espacio, nunca han tomado un lugar protagónico. Y es ahí donde mi primera intención fue indagar y desarchivar esos archivos, los pequeños archivos, ¿no? Y a la vez ir desbaratando los grandes archivos, o sea, la gran historia tal cual está, ir proponiendo otra al respecto. Y para eso voy a ir ahí Natasha.
Me gusta lo de desarchivar.
My intention has always been to go against the grain and to find stories that are not the main story, to contrast one story with another. Specifically, the story of women, which is an intimate story, the intimate history of Chile, the history of domestic spaces. These small stories have had no space. And so what I've tried to do is to dig up those archives and to contest the big narratives.
Y lo que he ido haciendo es ir rescatando esos pequeños archivos, pero también ir, como tú contabas, trabajando con otros que son mayores. La verdad, creo que me he ido, ¿cómo decirlo? Es un profesionalismo extraño el que he ido asumiendo cuando me enfrento a los archivos, porque he ido desarrollando cierta frialdad para poder, pero se entienda, ¿no? Es una frialdad que es la que me protege para poder trabajar, porque efectivamente muchas veces me encuentro con testimonios muy dolorosos, con experiencias muy crudas, y mi gran trabajo es poder entrar en ellos y convertirlos en literatura, que es justamente hacerlos leíbles, hacerlos empáticos, llegar de alguna u otra manera al corazón de alguien, porque me interesa mucho hacer ese efecto del recuerdo, ¿no? De pasarlos por el corazón. Y ese trabajo...
Y también, Nona, examinar las contradicciones, ¿no? De la historia.
Exacto. O sea, cómo se contrapone la historia oficial a las otras historias, que son mucho más, que son fragmentarias y que son contradictorias, y que es lo más interesante de la memoria y de la historia en general, que es inabarcable y es inclausurable. La historia es inclausurable, no tiene una versión, es imposible que tenga una versión. Y debiese ser esa la manera en que nos enfrentamos a la historia, ¿no? Y a la memoria, sin duda, a la historia y a la memoria colectiva.
So what I did was to rescue small narratives and also to work with the big narratives. And I developed a strange kind of professionalism when working with the archives, in the sense that I developed a kind of coldness that protected me. Because the material I was dealing with was very painful and raw, and I tried to enter into these stories and bring them to life, make them sympathetic, really reach the heart of them, which is what interests me. And then Lina said, yes, and the contradictions. And Nona replied, yes, the official stories and the way in which they contrast with the more fragmented, smaller stories, which is really what's most interesting about memory. And I think I maybe missed the last line.
I would like to say something, because Nona hasn't said much about her own novel, but I think that when I said contradictions, is also because this beautiful last novel that was published by Grey Wolf, The Twilight Zone, examines the life of a torturer, and this is the man who tortured, I think is the translation, a torturer who regrets his torture and actually speaks the truth to the cost, not of his life physically, but of his future, right? What that will mean for him. And I felt that it was a sort of a very beautiful way of examining a character. This is really a novel about a character. There's plenty of other stories, but it's really about this one man who lives in this tension forever, right? He can never leave behind what he did, even if he has confessed and helped the families of the disappeared, and also helped out in the trials. So I was thinking that that was a sort of a very important way of looking also at history, is not only talking about those who were the good ones, but also talk about the ones who were in this really sort of complex moment of history, and were sort of dragged into history and had to drag themselves out, but never completely. ¿Entendiste, Nona, o te lo traduzco?
Lo último no sé si te lo entendí bien.
No, sí, que la contradicción de este personaje, que en el fondo fue como introducido en la historia sin quererlo y tuvo que sacarse de la historia, pero nunca poder dejar atrás la historia.
Claro.
And yeah, and I also think that in some way that's what happens to my characters, that they carry something that they didn't really choose, but life sort of put them in a place, right? The loss of the mother, for example, and the anger that the elder brother feels for Ella, right? And he punishes her. And that's also sort of very complex to deal with, a man who punishes out of pain, right? And is he a good character or is he a bad character?
Pero es esta idea de que el país en el país del presente, el país del pasado siempre convive, ¿no? Es imposible, es imposible sacárselo de encima. Estamos habitando siempre ese tiempo circular, ¿no? Claro.
Lo que nos trae a tu pregunta de si podemos escapar del pasado. Yo creo que no.
Exactamente.
The country of the past and the present always coexist. We live in the circular time.
Yeah, and I also said that that answers Nona's previous question that had to do with, can we escape from the past? And it doesn't look like we actually can. But I think we're out of time now.
I'm just going to butt in and ask one audience question before we run out of time. And this is a question from Lily, and excuse my Spanish pronunciation, but the question is, can you talk a little more about having to carve out space as women in ese mundo literario masculino? How did Gabriela Mistral fit into the story of a literary Chile, if at all, when you were coming up? Was she respected, seen as antiquated? Did you see her as anti-feminist, or is that a relevant category? Finally, do you think there's anything particular to Chilean feminism as opposed to its trajectory in other countries? Obviously, many big questions. We don't have a ton of time, but if you guys
I
want
can
to
answer the first part, and I think Nona can answer the second, which tiene que ver con el feminismo y la manera en que las feministas han ingresado en la política.
Perfecto. Entendí la mitad de la pregunta, pero te voy a seguir, te sigo.
Ya.
Te sigo, Lina.
La primera parte tenía que ver con Mistral. ¿Cómo era que nos habíamos hecho espacio dentro del mundo literario? So I can't answer for Nona, but I know that the literary world was very difficult at the time. Even the professional world for women was difficult because there had been a setback. While in the Allende period, women were really out in the street and politicized and expected to have a profession or a job, right? Not to necessarily do the traditional, conventional female role. The dictatorship actually imposed sort of a setback to very conventional roles for women. So it wasn't only sort of a question of opening up in the literary field, but it was also like trying to sort of recover what being a woman had been in the 1970s and even the 60s, that had been sort of freer than during dictatorship. So unfortunately for us, the left-wing parties were also a little bit conventional in terms of what they expected women to do, and also very homophobic, which is what happened to Pedro Lemebel, who is a very important writer. So he had to struggle with that. And I think that also wasn't very easy for us women. But as we were saying in the beginning, the fact that there were all these literary workshops, that there was all this political complicity of really bringing down the dictatorship and the dictator who had stayed in power first as the leader of the Fuerzas Armadas, the armed forces, and later as a senator, thanks to his own constitution. So that's, I think that there was a sort of this activism that allowed women and us to open up spaces. And I think we helped each other throughout that time, right? We did have particular sort of vehement attacks on our works as if our works weren't so good, didn't count, etc. But in the end, everything sort of was a little bit, I think, has sort of been solved by itself, and thanks to ourselves keeping together. And then Gabriela Mistral, which is a figure I have worked on and done a compilation of her poetry. I think when we read her, y yo creo que esto te pasó también a ti, Nona, que cuando la leímos, it was very, she was read as the mother of the nation.
Sí.
But she was actually the queer mother of the nation. But that queerness was erased. So we would read the most sort of sad poems about children, but we didn't even have the opportunity to read them as political poems about poverty and about abandonment and about the state not paying attention to poor children. We read it as sort of this woman who was suffering because she wasn't a mother, and that was the role that she was sort of put into. But it has been actually now that we have finally been able to read her love letters to her partners and to read her more politicized essays and to reread her poetry as what it was, a very political poetry. She did have problems with feminism. She was a really old woman, right? And she didn't agree with feminism of equality, for example, and has been sort of described as almost anti-feminist. I don't think she was an anti-feminist. She really worked hard for women, but she had a sort of a different position. She wasn't, maybe she wasn't in the mainstream feminism of the time, and she also was conservative in some aspects, but in her personal life, she also was very transgressive. So I think that she didn't fit really clear molds. Perdona, Nona, no te traduje, pero creo que entendiste, ¿no?
Sí, y creo que hiciste una respuesta muy completa. Solo agregar que en la figura de Gabriela Mistral, que yo creo que ella ni ella misma sospechaba el nivel de vanguardia que conllevaba ella. Una indígena, lesbiana, con pensamiento político en ese tiempo, con una obra gigante, capaz de tocar todos los temas en su trabajo. Claro, pero es verdad lo que dice Lina, pero muy conservadora en muchas facetas de su vida, muy contradictoria sin duda, pero yo creo que Mistral es de esos personajes, ¿cómo decirlo?, fundacionales para la escritura chilena, no para la escritura de mujeres, ¿no? Es un personaje enorme, enorme, indescifrable. Yo diría que todavía nos queda mucho que descifrar de ella, sobre todo porque su figura ha sido muy, como decía Lina, fue una figura muy clausurada, nos la enseñaron de una manera. Y yo creo que todavía hay muchas capas más que debemos seguir investigando de Mistral.
Y luego está la pregunta del feminismo actual y su impacto en la política de hoy, pero vamos a dejar que Natasha pueda traducir primero.
So that was a very complete response. I'd just like to add that Gabriela Mistral, even she didn't know how avant-garde she was. Indigenous, queer, political, but she was conservative. She had many facets. She was contradictory, but she's a foundational figure, she's a foundational figure for Chilean literature. She's a huge figure, enormous figure, who still has not been completely understood, who's on some level indecipherable, because she was very much pigeonholed or shut up, categorized as a certain thing.
Sí, y sobre el feminismo y lo que está ocurriendo en Chile ahora, entiendo que por ahí va la pregunta.
Sí.
Sí. ¿Cómo es diferente en Chile que en otros países?
Perfecto. Sí, habría que decir que en Chile el feminismo ha sido, nosotros estamos viviendo en Chile un momento muy especial, estamos viviendo una revuelta social que ha devenido en una asamblea constituyente y en la escritura de una nueva constitución. Es un momento histórico muy importante. Y ese momento histórico ha sido empujado por la ciudadanía, sin duda, pero el feminismo ha sido protagónico para este empuje. Creo que esto no habría podido ocurrir si el feminismo no hubiese embalsamado, no embalsamado, contenido a todas las fuerzas políticas y sociales que estuvieron por décadas trabajando para que esto ocurriera. El feminismo fueron los vasos comunicantes para que pudiésemos hacer de todas las fuerzas una sola fuerza. Por lo tanto, voy a llegar hasta aquí por lo pronto ahora. Natasha, voy muy bien.
So feminism in Chile, it's a very special moment for feminism in Chile. It's also a moment of social revolution of the Constitutional Assembly. Chile has just approved the drafting of a new constitution. And this was pushed by the citizens, of course, but specifically by feminism. And feminism was key here. None of this would have happened if the feminists hadn't brought together all the political forces.
Sí, y una prueba de eso es que esta asamblea constituyente es la primera asamblea paritaria constituida con 50% de hombres y 50% de mujeres, y además es la primera asamblea que contiene también, la primera paritaria, y con escaños para los pueblos originarios, algo inédito en este país. Y la paridad es algo también inédito en el mundo, es como un regalo que está haciendo el feminismo chileno al mundo, la escritura de una constitución paritaria.
Uh-huh. Y presidida por una mujer mapuche.
Exactamente, una lamiana.
Presidida por una mujer mapuche. So the Constitutional Assembly requires equal representation of men and women. So half of the assembly is male and half of the assembly is female. It also sets aside a certain number of seats for the indigenous population. And in this sense, it's unprecedented. It has sort of given a gift to the world. And it is headed by a Mapuche representative, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
On that note, we're unfortunately out of time, but thank you all so much for joining us and having this amazing conversation. And thank you to all the people that joined us to watch tonight. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you both. Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Sí.
Everyone.
Muchas gracias. Natasha, muchas gracias.
Ay, de nada, sobrevivimos.
Lo hicimos.
Y además es un poco divertido, ¿no?
Sí, sí, mucho.